All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to welcome to Tuesday. I hope everyone had a nice long weekend and a nice Easter. If you celebrate Easter, and if not, you can just use it as an excuse to eat chocolate eggs because it's almost the best part of it anyway. Let me just say hi to some people who are here. So Noah is here. Good morning, Noah. Michelle is here. Good morning, Michelle. And Irene is here. Good morning, Irene. Right. So I think where we ended off, I guess it was on Wednesday now, where we ended off was we had finished talking about Rome and we'd kind of summarized it and we'd sort of put it to bed. And I have a few things that I can show you as kind of an end, a last kind of culture to squeeze into this course. I can talk to you a little bit about the First Nations people from British Columbia here. And so this is still a unit that I'm working on putting together, so it's not finished, but that's okay because we don't have a lot of time left anyway, so we won't really get a chance to finish it. But it is kind of interesting and useful because, of course, this is the part of the world that we live in, and that's kind of the original culture of BC, right? It's not the culture you see around it. The culture you see around it came with colonizers, came with Europeans, and so the original culture of this part of the world is that of indigenous people, and so it's certainly worthwhile to spend some time learning about what that's like. So, the first thing we'll say is that First Nations in BC are it's a very rich culture. But the cultures are also diverse. And so as we'll talk about very shortly, even within BC, there are numerous different First Nations cultures depending on where in the province that these people live. And so, again, we can't just think of First Nations as one group. It's actually a collection of different cultures who have some similarities, but also a lot of differences in terms of how they make their living, how they get their food, their spiritual or religious practices, their language, their technology, their clothing. All of these things are somewhat different. And so, again, we have a group of people that are related to each other, a group of cultures that are related to each other, but that are also distinct in their own right. The other thing I'll kind of add in here, and we've talked about this a little bit in social justice, is that there are some important terms to use and not to use. One of the reasons that we have terms that we don't use is because there is a history of marginalization and colonization and some would argue genocide towards Indigenous people here in Canada. And so there's still a lot of prejudicial ideas and racism surrounding that, and so some of these terms are a little bit more problematic than others, right? So for my part, you'll often hear me use First Peoples or First Nations or Indigenous. Those are the three terms that I will use to describe Indigenous people in Canada. Aboriginal is kind of for some people it's okay, some people it's not, right? And the point here is that if you're abnormal, what are you? You're not normal. So if you're Aboriginal, you are not original. But as it turns out, these people are the original people. They are the first people to actually come to North America. So they are original people. So why we're calling them Aboriginal, I could not tell you. But yeah, the people who are Aboriginal here are people like me. Yeah, we are the Aboriginals. They are the originals. So I don't know, again, why that term is in use, but some people are okay with it, some people aren't. I just kind of steer away from it because it's weird for that reason. Nobody uses Red Indian anymore. I think as we talked about in social justice, the term Indian got used because when Christopher Columbus first found the New World, or when he sort of bumped into it, he was looking for a route to India, right? And so when he landed, he saw a bunch of indigenous people running around and said, "Hey, look, Indians." They're not Indians. They're not from India. They're not related to people from India. But the name kind of stuck. And so we don't usually refer to them as Indians anymore. The sort of correct terminology here is indigenous or First Nations or First Peoples or Aboriginal if you so choose. Right. So to start with, who are absolutely.
So the problem with red Indian, we are calling them, so it's because of India, not like because of people related to them.
So the term Indian is a reference to who Columbus thought he was dealing with, because when he landed in North America, he didn't know it was there. This is in 1492. He didn't know it was there. He thought he had landed in India because that's where he was trying to go. And so he saw these people here and thought, oh, okay, these are Indians. As it turns out, this is not India. Those people aren't Indians. They're not related to people from India. And so red Indian got used because to distinguish between the Indians from India and the indigenous people here. And so it had to do with kind of it was kind of a skin color thing, but it's kind of it's racist terminology is what it is at this point. Indian's not great either, but the problem with Indian is that it's kind of a legal term in Canada. My social justice class will know that there's still an Indian Act that is in force in Canada, and so we're kind of stuck still using that word to talk about the legal stuff. You're a status Indian or non-status Indian in Canada, so we still have to use this terminology because it's legal, but the green check marks are really what you want to say. Right, so who are these people? Where do they come from? And what was life like before us pale Europeans came here, right? So I'll let you read this, but I think maybe actually let me just look at it again and see if I want you to read first or if I want to show you some things first. Sorry. I just got to remind myself what is in this piece of reading. There it is. Okay. Right. Okay. I'm going to talk first, and then we'll read. Okay. So. Oh, that's the wrong one. So. Again, I may have mentioned this a little bit earlier in the course. I'm just going to review it quickly. Prior to about 15,000 years ago or so, there is nobody in North America. Okay, and again, there's a few archaeological sites that contradict that claim. The peopling of the Americas is actually a complicated process, and it probably happens at a bunch of different times, not just one time, so I'm going to sort of oversimplify it a little bit here. But what you would find is if you looked at North America any time between about 100,000 years ago and about 12,000 years ago, you would see this. So Canada itself is covered in a glacier, and so this is a sheet of ice about 1 kilometer thick. Yeah, and it's basically covering all of the top part of North America. Okay, so again, there are no people really living here. There's no way to get into North America. North America just has animals in it, and that's it.
So is it the red one that you're talking about that's covered in glacier?
No, the white part. Yeah. So the white part is entirely covered in ice. basically for 100,000 years. And so, again, humans, we evolve in Africa, we spread out of Africa, and we sort of spread into Europe and Asia and Southeast Asia. But humans can't really get into North America because of this situation here, right? It is, the top part of it is covered in ice, and there's really no way in. Until we hit about 12,000 years ago. And so the Earth's climate is constantly fluctuating, right? It's getting warmer, it's getting colder, and so it starts to warm up again around 12,000 years ago. And so the ice starts to melt, sea levels start to rise, and in the process there's this kind of sweet spot where the ice has melted but the sea hasn't totally risen to modern levels yet. And so you can see here that what's now Alaska and northern Canada is actually connected to northeast Russia. And so this allows people to just walk right across from what was Asia into North America. And so a lot of the first people to actually enter North America come from here. They come from northeastern Russia, and they move down into what's now the US and Canada. Of course, they're not Russians, because this is, thousands of years before Russians exist. But they are indigenous people, and they are the ancestors of all indigenous people in North and South America. So again, those ice sheets closed off North America to migration from humans, but once the global temperature starts to warm, ice starts to melt, and people are able to move across. And of course, as the ice continues melting, it will cut that off again, right? So we know now that those two pieces of land are not connected, right? There's a sea in between. And so now the sea level has come up to the point where Russia and Alaska are not connected, right? So these people began to migrate first into the sort of northern part of North America. I'm just going to go back a little bit. 12. So first into kind of Alaska here, where you can see the ice melted, and then they were able to travel through this ice-free corridor. And so this area kind of opened up probably closer to the BC-Alberta border, where people could move through this open area and then into the rest of North and South America. And so again, they started doing that around 12,000 years ago or so, and began to people to spread into North and South America. There's also probably some people that found their way along the coast, and so the coast, as you might know, is usually warmer than it is inland, and so the coastal areas probably started to melt away first. And so there were likely people with boats that were able to kind of move down the coast a little bit earlier. And so you can see here we've got people moving in to the central part of what's now Canada, and then we've got some people moving along the coast. And you can see some archaeological sites here at Paisley Cave in, I'm thinking that's Oregon. We have people there around 14,000 years ago. We have people kind of in the north central United States around 12,500 years ago. People moving in around 13,000 years ago. There's some sites in northern British Columbia that date to 17,000 years ago. So there's people kind of floating around that area, but once the ice starts to melt, then people can kind of come in and spread, right? And so we know this based on archaeological evidence that we have, and we also know it based on mitochondrial DNA. So if you do analyses of mitochondrial DNA, you can actually chart when certain human populations separated out and moved on to new places. Do you know what a mitochondria is? It's the what? Yeah, it's part of your cells, right? It's the powerhouse of the cell, is what everyone says in biology. Interestingly, though, those little organelles, those little mitochondria, they actually have their own DNA sequence. And that DNA sequence is not the same as yours. So mitochondria carry their own DNA within your cells, and those DNA mutate at a fairly regular rate. And so that's kind of what allows genetic scientists to figure out when certain human groups separated out and diverged from each other. You can count mutations back. So it almost works, it works like a bit of a genetic clock, if you will. And so scientists have been able to do this sort of thing, study modern human genomes, and figure out when certain groups of people is separated out from others. And so a mix of mitochondrial DNA and archaeological evidence kind of helps to tell us the story of how people first came to be in North America. So yeah, the first people coming across were hunters and were gatherers. And so you probably would have seen, you know, people in this part of the world running around hunting mammoths. And to be honest, the reason that we don't have mammoths here today is probably partly due to climate change, but also partly due to hunting. So humans used to, believe it or not, run up to these terrifying beasts and stick them with pointy sticks, right? Which seems like an incredibly dangerous thing to do. But this is how people were kind of making their living at the time. We said early on, and again, this is a bit of a circle back to the beginning part of the course, we said that these people were foragers, they were hunter-gatherers. So there was no farming going on, they were collecting and hunting their food from the natural world, right? And probably the first people to come into North America were probably almost exclusively hunters, right? You can probably guess this, but as you go further north, there's less and less plant life, right? That you can eat, right? You can't, so there's no fruit trees, there's fewer berry trees, you know, the berries that exist are only available in very narrow parts of the year. Maybe there's some nuts and roots, but most of what you're eating the further north you go is meat and fish, right? So the earliest people here would have been full-time hunters, most of their diet coming from meat or fish or, you know, the animals that they hunted, right? Again, this is something that humans had done for thousands and thousands of years before, and you know, and that sort of tradition of hunting and gathering would continue really all the way up until Europeans came here in the 16 or 1700s. And so this was kind of the natural way of life of these people, was to hunt and to gather. Whoops. Oh, okay. I will say that. Trying to paint a picture of what was going on here in British Columbia in the past few thousand years is difficult, because the first people that came to North America were probably very few in number. Okay, so you probably would have had a group of, you know, 30 coming in, and then maybe another group of 30 or 40, and, you know, very small groups of people were sort of arriving in this part of the world. And again, we know that hunter-gatherers don't own a lot of things, right? They don't leave behind a lot, and they don't live in, usually they don't live in big populations. They usually don't live in big groups. And so when you're looking for archaeology, when you're trying to tell the story of these people through archaeology, there's not really much there. And so it's really difficult to find the kinds of things that you're looking for as an archaeologist to understand this period of time. We said that these people also move around quite a bit, right? The strength of hunting and gathering is that you are able to move, right? So you constantly move to a point where you can find food easily, right? If you stay in one place for too long, you'll kind of eventually eat through all the food, right? But if you keep moving around, then you'll always find new food resources. And so hunter-gatherers move a lot, but they don't actually work super hard to get their food, right? Their food is always readily available as long as they keep as long as they keep moving every few days, which most hunter-gatherers do. So the mobility is the key to their strategy, right? The key to their success is moving a lot. This was true of foraging humans, but also foraging humans in BC, that they live in a wide range of environments, right? So here in British Columbia, we have people living on the coast. Well, hundreds or thousands of years ago, we had people living on the coast. If you move further up the coast, it's a little different, right? It's a little cooler, it's a little wetter. If you move up into northern BC, you have really cold sort of pine forests. If you move into central BC, into the Okanagan, you'll see, Adel, you can confirm for me that the environment's a little different around Kelowna and around Kamloops, right? Yeah, what's it like?
Cold.
In the winter?
Yeah.
Colder in the winter, and then were you there in the spring or summer? Yeah, you were.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's it like?
Very cold.
Yeah, really hot and really dry, right?
Right.
It's almost desert-like, right? So here in BC, we have actually a bunch of different environments, either on the coast or inland. Some places are really dry. It's colder inland. It's warmer by the sea, and so we have people that are living here, and they're going to develop different cultures and different subsistence strategies based on the environment that they live in, right? I'm just going to skip ahead just a little bit because we've seen some of these before. Right, this is where I want to get to. So this is only a section of BC. This isn't all of BC. And you can see how many different cultural groups that we have traditionally living in this part of the world. And so you'll see Vancouver there toward the bottom. It's right there, that little red dot. And so we're in Coast Salish territory. And so the people who lived here were belonging to a kind of Coast Salish cultural group, if you will, and language group. But there were three smaller groups within that. And so the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam. Those are kind of three smaller kind of regional groups that lived within this one culture. And so, again, there's lots and lots of different groups of people traditionally living in BC. And again, you can see, I don't know, how many are there? 12, 13? And those are just broad groups themselves. Do you remember, I showed you this earlier, did I not? Yeah? So one of the interesting things that happens here in BC is that the hunter-gatherers or the foragers that we see in this part of BC tend to be complex hunter-gatherers or complex foragers. And so they are ones that, because there's so many food resources available in this part of the world, they're able to stay in one place longer and live in larger groups, okay? And so people here, rather than moving every few days, they might have moved, they might have stayed in one village in the winter and then moved to different areas in the spring and summer and fall, right? And so people in this part of the world had large organized villages. People had things, they had stuff, right? They had storage boxes and canoes and all kinds of tools and masks and costumes and and totem poles and all kinds of things. Indigenous people, hunter-gatherers in this part of the world, had some social hierarchy in their communities. So there were power and status differences in those communities. They stored a lot of their food, and we'll get to this in a second, but this is an important part of what makes their life way possible in this part of the world, is that they're able to collect a lot of food at once and then store it away. And we'll also see that they have much more technology than your average hunter-gatherer. And so, again, most hunter-gatherers have to carry everything they own with them, so their technology tends to be very light and very simple and very easy to carry. But if you don't have to move so much, you can create more technology, right? You can create more stuff. And so we see lots of boxes and spears and costumes and what else am I thinking of? Canoes, and you'll see there's a ton of stuff that people made. Right. So by about 10,000 years, we're looking at a British Columbia that looks very similar to the British Columbia that we know and love in terms of the environment. And so, let me see here what I've got. That sort of complex pattern that we see later in history probably takes some time to develop. And so again, the first people here are probably simple foragers moving around a lot. And then eventually they will start to kind of settle down a little more. They'll start to stay put in one place, and their culture groups will sort of evolve and develop from there. Let me just see here. Right. So the thing that's going to allow these early British Columbians to change from simple foragers to complex foragers is specifically salmon. Okay? Do you know what a salmon is? What's a salmon? It's a fish. Yeah, it's kind of pink or orange color. You see it in the market quite frequently. The salmon is a critical animal for the indigenous people of this part of the world. Again, it allows them to change their subsistence strategy and go from kind of simple foragers that move around every couple days to more complex foragers that stay in one place, that build villages, that create social hierarchies, that invent different types of technologies. All of those things happen really because of the salmon, okay? And so it allowed that because, again, if you know the life cycle of the salmon, which I'm sure, Baha, you know, right? You're an avid studier of the salmon life cycle, yes? Kind of?
Because I do so many posts about indigenous.
Okay. Well, what do you know about the salmon?
So they start in the north, they were born. So the eggs are laid up in the north against the water frame. Then when the fish on happen like that carries the eggs, goes up there, lay the eggs, then pass away. Right over there. Then the fish starts their life cycle from there, get out of the egg, swim with the current, go to the ocean. Mothers do the same thing, go back to where they were born, lay some eggs, right?
Yeah. I was just joking, but actually you do know what you do know what you're talking about. Okay, that's great. Yeah, you're exactly right. So yeah, the salmon are hatched from eggs in the rivers of British Columbia. They grow up and they swim out to sea, and these salmon live their adult lives in the ocean, and then when it's time for them to mate and to lay eggs, they swim back up the rivers of British Columbia. And like you said, often they swim up the same river that they were actually born in. How they do this, I have no idea. It seems, yeah, GPS, some sort of salmon smartphone. If they have service under there, I don't know. But I don't know how they do it, but they manage to do it. And so in the fall, what would happen is that huge numbers of salmon would come pouring up the rivers in British Columbia. And of course, indigenous people, they're not fools. They knew this, and they were ready to collect that salmon. And so for, a period of a few weeks in every fall, indigenous people would get as many salmon as they could. They would harvest them, they would dry out the meat, and they could use this to survive the winter. And so the ability to sort of collect all of that food at once and store it away, dry it and store it, is what allowed them to stay in one place for a longer period, and what allowed them to, allow their numbers to grow a little bit, right? We said that, do you remember, this is close to the beginning of the course, we read an article by Jared Diamond, The Worst Mistake in the History of and that's what Jared said, right, is that once your population gets too big, you have to start farming, right? You have to sort of raise the carrying capacity of the land. And for indigenous people here in BC, they never did that, but what they did was they started storing the food that they would accumulate, right? They would start, and so they started it with salmon, but they didn't end there. They were able to dry out other types of meat, berries. They were able to collect the fat from fish and store the fat away. And so they were able to do this with all kinds of different food sources. And so in the winter, when there's not a lot of food available, these people would have, a full freezer, if you will, of food that they could eat, right? Yeah, so there's a typical salmon. There's a bunch of different species. I think there's probably 6 of them, maybe 6 different species of salmon here in British Columbia. That's a pink salmon, I think. And again, you can see them pouring into the rivers of British Columbia in the fall. Last year, it's kind of in October, like mid to late October is when it kind of happens. And again, huge numbers of fish. Lots of local fishermen like to go fishing for them because there's well, there's certainly a lot of them in one place, right? Still fishing. That's my dad, actually, by the way. But yeah, he likes to fish. So so this is the fish that this is the food resource that allows people to become a little more sedentary and allows them to, good morning, and allows them to kind of diversify their, allows them to become more sedentary and allows them to grow their population, okay? What else was I going to say? Yeah, maybe that's all I was going to say. Right, so for BC's First Nations, this is what kind of gets them from one stage to the other, right? For people in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, it's wheat, right? Wheat is what gets them from hunter-gathering to the next step, which is farming. But in this part of the world, it's the salmon that gets people from simple hunter-gatherers to a more complex form of subsistence strategy and a more complex form of culture as well, okay? Right, and so as British Columbia became more populous, right, as indigenous communities who came here, 12,000 years ago began to slowly grow, as they began to harvest the salmon and store it away, as their numbers and populations grew, the cultural complexity began to develop as well. And so, again, we saw larger populations. We saw people with social hierarchies, right, with some people having more status and power than others. We saw people trading different products with each other. One of the products they used to trade actually is fish oil. And so people that were on the coast would have a lot of access to fish. They would boil up the fish, collect the oil, and then they would trade the oil with people who lived further away from the ocean. And these trails that they used to move this fish oil along were called grease trails. And so people would trade with other people further inland for this fish oil or fish fat. Some groups actually fought with each other. There was actually minor warfare going on between groups. And again, This is not typical for simple hunter-gatherers. Simple hunter-gatherers will just leave rather than fight with each other. But complex foragers would actually go to war with each other. Lots of art, heraldic art. So art that told you who a group of people were, whether a family or a clan or a culture. Lots of art that sort of says who people are. And lots of complex ceremonies like the potlatch, which we'll talk about a little bit as well. Okay, so now I think is a good point to, I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to go back to this short reading that I want you to do. And so it talks a little bit about who Indigenous people are, sort of historically, but also in terms of their place in Canada's governance structure, if you will. So it's a little bit of past, but also a little bit of present in this reading as well. Okay, so I'll just let you read it really quickly. There's a few questions at the end, and then we'll keep going. Okay, so the handout is in, or the reading is in Microsoft Teams, as you might guess. So I'll give you some time to read, and then we'll talk. Okay.
Like for which part do you want to count and which part?
Yeah, so the question I'm asking number 6 is how do you know that you have two different groups of First Nations people and they're not the same? How do you divide them up? What's that?
So you're asking why it's difficult, right?
Yes.
Because because the information contradicts between two ethnic groups.
Yeah. So sometimes what people say, like we're these people and those people are different. Sometimes the other people will say something in contradiction, right? So there's some contradictory stories going around. What else is kind of confusing?
Or it might be some people that say, oh, we're from this group, so they can take the benefits of this life.
Could be, yeah. People might have a vested interest in saying they belong to one group or another. That's possible. Let me help you along a little bit here. The point I kind of wanted to drive home with this is that what we're trying to do is that we're trying to take a kind of a Western system of classification and we're trying to impose it on Indigenous people, right? And in the past, Indigenous people probably had no real reason to divide up cultures, right? They probably had no reason to figure out, okay, well, here we're the Coast Salish and the Nuchalnuth are on the other side of Vancouver Island, so what makes us us and them them, right? Let's sit down, everybody, and create some criteria so that we know what makes the Nuchalnuth different from us Coast Salish, right? And how do we know, what about the people to the north? What makes them different? And so it's kind of a process that Indigenous people probably never would have done. It's kind of more of a scientific process. And so, again, it kind of runs into trouble because, First Nations people would have had all kind of different motivations and reasons for seeing other groups as similar or different from themselves. And those concerns might not align with science, right? And so here you see kind of a Western scientific approach trying to be imposed on these Indigenous communities, and it doesn't quite work, right? Because again, these are things that Indigenous people probably wouldn't have done, right? They certainly knew that there were other groups of Indigenous people in the province. They definitely knew that they were similar in some ways or different in other ways, but they never would have sat down and worked out a criteria, right? Or they never would have sat down to figure out, okay, let's agree how many nations we have in BC here. They never would have done that. And so again, you're trying to get one system to conform to a scientific system, and it just don't always fit together. You know what I mean? That was the worst explanation in the history of education. But that's kind of what I wanted to drive home, is that it's difficult to do because you're trying to take a Western system and impose it on an Indigenous thing that the Indigenous people probably never would have done, right? They probably wouldn't have spent any time at all thinking about how do we divide up cultural groups in BC. It's just not a thing that they would have done. Okay, where were we? Oh yeah, we were right here. So, going back to the peopling of BC. So again, we don't really know how many people were in BC at any given time because similar to dividing up culture groups, it may or may not surprise you that Indigenous people hundreds or thousands of years ago had no reason to do a census, right? They didn't do a census, they didn't try to figure out how many people were around, and so they didn't really know, and neither did we. And so, using indigenous oral traditions, so the stories that have been told, using archaeological research, using historical records. The estimate is that when Europeans first started coming to this province in serious numbers, there were somewhere between 80 to 500,000 indigenous people here in BC. And again, that's a pretty wide estimate, right? 80 to 500. We're really not sure. As you can see here, probably between maybe 250,000 to 300,000 in the entire province, which when you think about it is not very much, right? How many people live in the Lower Mainland now? I think it's about, I guess it depends on where you draw, where you draw the line, right? I thought it was about 2.4 is what I thought it was. So yeah, we have a couple of million people here just in the Lower Mainland. Indigenous people had a tenth of that, right? Just 10% of that in the entire province. So yes, there were a lot of indigenous people living here, but by modern standards, not so much, right? There was lots of open land, and again, you need that if you're hunting and gathering. Again, most people were living either on the northwest coast, so all along the coast here from like Seattle, Vancouver, all the way up the coast, or in the interior plateau, which again is around the Kelowna and Kamloops kind of area, and then the subarctic, which is way up north, okay? But interestingly, this part of the world, around Vancouver and on the northwest coast, was probably some of the most densely populated areas of North America prior to the Europeans. And so, you know, there were no cities thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago. There were no cities, but the place where you would find the most people would have been here along the northwest coast of BC and of the US. Was what? Was what near Hope? No, that's further in. Yeah, so Kelowna, Kamloops, Penticton. What's that?
There are many Kamloops.
Yeah, because there's half of Kamloops is indigenous land, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, if you go over and you can see very clearly, and Kelowna's like that too. There's big chunks of it that belong to the indigenous groups, right? So yeah, there's people kind of living in the subarctic here, people living along the northwest coast, people living in the plateau, right? The warmer, in the summer anyway, the warmer inner part. So it's interesting because when you look at these three groups, you can see some cultural differences even from the housing that they use. And so here on the northwest coast, you would find that people were, for a good chunk of the year, living in large wooden houses, and so particularly in the winter. And so these houses were made of cedar, and so cedar are those trees that you see all around BC. They're really tall, the really big tall ones, and they smell really nice. And so they kind of looked like this, and they were really massive, some of them. And so here you can see that the indigenous people have built a frame for this house. This is a house that would have housed several families at the same time. And so, what's that? Well, how it worked was that the people who were kind of higher status or had more prestige in the community, they would be further toward the back, because the door is, as we all know, the door is where it's coldest, right? It's coldest by the door. So the lower status families lived by the door. The higher status families got to live further back. But again, there would have been lots of different families living in one of these houses. And as you can see, they're really, really big. This is a woman, I think, right? Right here? They're really, really big, and they would have been covered in these planks of cedar. So yeah, here's a big house. This is a modern one, but it's at it's Alert Bay. And so if you go up to Haida Gwaii, which is a little ways up the coast, it's quite beautiful. I'd like to go there one day, but I haven't been there yet. Or, yeah, I think that's where this is. Is it? I'm not sure. But this is a good representation of what one of these houses would have been like. Yeah. You can also see some models of them at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC. If you go there, you can see some of these. Yeah, so lowest ranking families would have been closest to the entrance. And you would often see some evidence of the kinship group that lived in the house on the front, either in the painting that was done on the face of it, or the totem pole itself, right? So if you were coming toward the house, you would know what family lived in that house, right? And whether they belonged to maybe the Eagle clan, or the Bear clan, or the Killer Whale clan, or the Wolf clan. You would know simply by the artwork, right? Yeah, so these houses would have been covered. There would have been fires going inside. There would have been sleeping platforms and shelves and storage boxes for food and other things. And so, again, these people could stay there during the winter and have a nice, comfortable, warm place to live. Lots of families living around you. Probably lots of kids. Yeah. All right. And so this is probably what you would have found at the far, far end of the house. And so this is kind of a ceremonial area. And so this is where if you had a party or a ritual, it would take place towards the back of the house. And so you can see here we've got some totem poles. There's a it looks like an altar, but I think it's actually a drum, so that you can beat out a rhythm while people dance and sing and things like that. But you would find that at the back of that house as well. And there'd be lots of them. And so here you can see in this kind of artist's imagining, a winter village of some people on the northwest coast might look kind of like this. And you can see probably about, I don't know, 10 or 12 big houses clustered together, right, with multiple families living in all of them. And so there might be, there might be a few hundred people living in this village for the winter, right? And you could see which family belonged to, or which house belonged to which family by the totem poles that are put outside, right? Yeah, here's another. This is a historic photo, probably mid to late 1800s for this photo, probably late 1800s. This is a little further down the coast, down into California, where they built their houses a little differently than they do here. I think the ones here are nicer, but it's just my opinion. Yeah, and sometimes you would find that in the summer, what the indigenous people would do is they would take all of the boards off of the outside of those big houses, and they would take them with them. And so you might move, to another area during the summer to hunt and to fish, and you might use those boards just to quickly construct a simple house for the summer. And so they might build this really quickly, and then at the end of summer they would take all those boards off and bring them back to the big house and put them back up. And so the house frame would stay where it was, but the outside coating, they would sometimes take it with them and use it in other places. Yeah, so some more artwork. Again, this is a little bit down the northwest coast, more in California kind of thing. You can see people hanging their laundry and kids playing and the dog and, very kind of typical things. Yeah, so again, you'd have a village during the winter of probably a couple hundred or a few or up to 1,000 people. Right. If you moved into the inner plateau, so if you moved into the interior of British Columbia, you would see a different type of house. So those people were living in different environments. They were using different animals and plants as their food sources, and they built different houses as well. And so in that part of BC, they would build pit houses. And so pit houses are partially below ground. You dig them into the earth, and then you create a roof with wooden logs and timber. And so they would kind of look, on the outside, they would look something like this. And so kind of just looks like a mound, if you will, with a ladder coming out the top. But that hole at the top would also be for fire smoke coming out as well. And if you went inside, it might look something like this. And so this is a museum exhibit. I think this is at the Museum of British Columbia in Victoria. So if you ever go there, you can actually see this, I think. But you can see that they've kind of stripped away part of it so you can see how it's built. You can see the little ladder they've created that goes up and down so you can go down into the house. Go back here. Along the outside edge, there'd be kind of sleeping platforms so people could sleep there. There'd be a fire in the middle. And again, it would be nice and warm because, as Adel points out, it's kind of cold in the winter, right? Yeah, so if you're below ground and you've got a fire and you've got a nice roof on top of you, and maybe you've got a layer of snow on top too to help keep you warm, yeah, it's a nice, people survived this way for thousands of years, right? Yeah, and so I think there was actually a course, could have been at UBC Okanagan, but I forget, where you could actually build a pit house. And so this is actually, I don't know if they still offer the course, but yeah, these students actually built this house in the style of indigenous people hundreds or thousands of years ago. And as you can see, there's a lot of room on the inside, right? And it's probably a very comfortable place to live, right? Yeah, so you had a hole in the roof where you could get in and out, but also where smoke could get out. Yeah, and each one was occupied by about 30 or 40 related individuals. So, they might have been, some of them might have been a little on the cramped side, but at least it keeps you nice and warm during the winter, right? Okay, that's all I have to say about housing. So, I will end it there. Tomorrow I've got a little bit for you about diet, and then I think I've got some mythology and story to talk about with you as well. But until then, I'll leave it there. You can pack it up, and I'll see you all tomorrow.